everyone comes in. But welcome to First Friday. Welcome to some of you to another First Friday, and others of you, hi, well, for the first time. So nice to see you here. I would like to welcome Sophie Pierce and Annabelle Pettigrew to today's session. We're going to kick off. We just had a very good conversation about the kind of commonality in the work that these artists are doing. We may hopefully have some conversation around that, but as time is moving on quickly, I want to first of all invite Annabelle to talk about the work that she's been doing and the group of artists that she's been convening. So Annabelle, I'm going to go over to you.
Thanks, Richard. Hi, everyone. So I suppose I'll sort of take you through a bit of a timeline of how I've set this up and what I'm working on at the moment. I'm Annabelle, I'm based in Frome. I'm a contemporary artist. I started Throes of Grief last year. And it's a project which has two arms to it really at the moment. One part of it is it's a research, an artist-led research collective, and the other part is the DYCP funding, which I was awarded earlier this year. It's all research based at the moment. I started it in following the death of my father in 2017. I had a very particular, I've always been a collaborative artist, and collaboration has been a huge part of what I've, of my making process always. I had a very particular collaborative process with my partner Rob at the time, and following my father's death, which was completely, as you know, as grief enters our life completely unexpectedly, something which I've now started to call the grief in, without wanting to make it sound too dry and academic. I found that I wasn't able to interact with my practice in the way that I had been previously, and it felt completely and utterly alien. I left London and came to start my new life in Somerset, and after taking about a year off from the studio, went back into the studio and started making work again, and really wasn't able to find the right language that I needed to make work anymore. It sort of seemed completely alien. You know, I actually remember looking down at my hands one day and thinking that they had changed so completely, the hands that I had made this previous work with, and realizing that every single cell in my body had changed due to this process. And it was in my practice as well. So I started to make work in a really, I sort of gave into the process. So I started to make things in a very sort of subconscious way, following an instinctive compulsion. And I started working with clay. And I'm going to show you a piece of work on here. This is the first piece of work. There we go. I'm hoping you can see that now. So I started to make these pots, which I hadn't worked in clay for a really long time. This is called John Barleycorn's daughter. I compulsively rolled out clay and pressed wheat into it, and then started playing around with colours. And I kept going, and was sort of living in a house that was full of these pots everywhere, sort of trying to step around them on a daily basis. And I knew that I wanted to stop when I got to 65, and I didn't know at the time why 65 was the number that it was. And then later realised that, of course, my father had lived for 65 years. And so this work kind of became an ode, as a process. I committed to the process of kind of going through this grief work, I suppose. And it became a sort of ode to my father, And around that time, a friend of mine came to visit, who was an artist who I really respect, who I've collaborated with before, who has a very similar art school education to me. And I showed him this piece of work and told him the process and told him that there was one for every year of my father's life. And his response was, well, yes, but nobody needs to know that. And he wasn't saying it in a way which was kind of poo-pooing the work. It was just that he didn't know how to interact with any sort of theme of grief. It was like the theme of grief or any themes associated with grief weren't relevant. They weren't academic or contemporary enough to be discussed in contemporary arts practice. And so that was a real turning point. And at that point, I decided I needed a kind of a support group, in as much as it was not a therapeutic group, but a place that I could talk about my practice and really examine these new themes that had come up, which I had no concept of, didn't know what they were, but I needed to work through them. So I put an open call out called Throes of Grief. I didn't know what else to call it at the time. So it was this sort of very raw title, and had a really fantastic response from lots of artists working with grief. A kind of combination of people who were perhaps like art therapists or people who wanted a support group that was therapeutic. So I had these very intense conversations with probably 35 people, and then sort of whittled down a group of 8 artists, including myself, who are all contemporary art makers, photographer, but we've got a photographer, a bookmaker, people who work with paint, people who work with performance, and I will put their I've got a link tree actually of links so you can see who they are, which I will share in the chat. So we started that, and we kind of, like a sort of a band of brothers, I suppose, had these sort of similar themes that we wanted to explore. And it's not that all of us were necessarily artists who define themselves as grief workers, but sometimes there are threads of grief which manifest in our work, and we can't necessarily identify what they are. So by being in this collective, we were able to identify those, pull them out and talk about them in a forum which was non-judgmental, which didn't think that the subject was not academic enough, and to really give space for that conversation to grow, and to grow this language, the language of grief in our work, and to have that dialogue unashamedly. So we now function, we have artist-led workshops where each member of the collective will kind of conceive of a workshop, they'll formulate something, then trial it on our group. And we've had some fantastic workshops recently. Last week we did one called the Grief Gymnasium, which was we were all asked to respond visually to a list of words that were read out, all associated with grief, and we made these kind of these drawings, these kind of list type drawings. Emma Douglas ran something called the Empathy and Emotion Workshop, which was a postal workshop where somebody would make a visual response to another piece of work received by an artist, again around the themes of grief, responding completely, trying to put a sort of emotion into a visual response. So very niche conversation, but not what we were taught in art school. And I think that's really where this kind of, where it gets really interesting, the development of this language and applying it to our practice. And then the other part of Throes of Grief is the DYCP funding, which I got last month. I wrote a proposal to have something called collaborative conversations with every member of the Throes of Grief collective. So it's essentially a deep dive into the kind of the most prevalent theme of our practices, and having these visual collaborative conversations between them. So expanding further the niche part of our practice, which might relate to grief. Sometimes it's completely overt, and the grief is the dominant thing in the work, but sometimes it's not. So really, that's it in a bit of a sort of rambly nutshell. That's the Throes of Grief. I'm just going to pop our link in the chat so you can all see it. This is everybody in the group. There we go. So yes.
You know, the kind of breadth of practice, what kind of artists responded to your call out? Did they talk about why? Anything else that you want to tell us, you know, about the group and where you feel that it's gone so far?
Yeah. So interestingly enough, there's, I mean, so the different types of practice of people in the group is wide and varied. But everybody, I've had the same conversation with every single member, which kind of goes along the lines of, I felt like I was operating in the dark, like I was alone, fumbling through this, trying to put something together. And the interesting thing about grief is that I always liken it to, you're sort of all of a sudden part of a club that you don't really want to be a part of. And you have these brief moments of human interaction with somebody where it's like, for a sort of split second, if you connect with them, you can sort of see into their soul for a nanosecond. And it's like they're saying to you, I understand how you're feeling. And there's a sort of an empathy. But the interesting thing is that it's fleeting. These parts, these parts of this human interaction that we have, unless you're engaging in a sort of therapeutic way, these parts, you know, people might say something which is really heartfelt, which is, you know, you're doing really well, or keep going. But that's where the conversation ends. So as varied as everyone's practice might be, we've got these common threads which tie us all together. And I suppose I sort of started to think of it like chapters in a book. There's somebody who, the overriding theme is faith. Somebody else where it's intensity, marking the passing of time with somebody else. And some of these collaborative conversations are actually really, they're quite fun. I'm playing a game of exquisite court with somebody. Again, all grief-centric responses, and it's this postal exchange. So I think in our group, Davina, who's a member of our group, I think might be on the call, is she has a PhD in grief and loss. And I sort of lovingly called her the grande dame of grief and loss in contemporary arts practice. And she's been researching this and writing about this for a long time. And her insight,
I think Davina is on the call.
yeah.
Did you want to ask her to come in? Davina,
Yes.
do you want to come in and say hello?
Hi. I'm here.
Hi, Davina.
Hi. Oh, it's very, very kind of you. I don't, it's a funny thing having a PhD about grief and loss, because I never feel expert really, because everybody's grief is so different and so particular. But I think what the group gives to me is a place to explore both the particularities of our grief, so the similarities and the differences. And I think those are really interesting things to tease out and look at. Yeah. My PhD was about how we live with the presence of absence. So it was a particular focus about living with grief, walking with grief, rather than a kind of notion of getting over it, which I think is quite key to our group as well, is like we're finding ways to explore through what we do, which is contemporary arts practice. And it does take it. I think also what's exciting is that we all have very different forms of practice. So we work with different materials in different ways. Yeah, but so there's a excitement around that in terms of sharing ideas and thoughts and being playful with each other.
Yeah. And I think that really sums it up. You know, it's this commitment to just letting yourself explore it, and not kind of saying, you know, that eventually there will be an end point for a project, but actually committing to developing the language, and actually having a deep dive. What is it? And realizing that, as Davina says, it can be playful. It doesn't have to be this maudlin kind of response. It's not about defining ourselves as grief workers. It's about saying, what are these threads?
I'm going to ask Sophie to join us, just to basically ask the question whether how much of this chimes with your, you know, your own creative response to working through a process of grief. Sophie, you are muted at the moment, by the way.
Unpracticed. Yeah, I think it's finding your way out of a situation which takes hold of you in life that you've just never dealt with before. And as Annabelle says, it's kind of trying to find a language or a voice or an expression of what's happened. And it is very much like you said, Annabelle, you're gripped by this thing that's happened, and there aren't very many points of contact with others where you can kind of feel that sense of communication or connection over something that's happened. And yet grief is so universal. You know, it happens to all of us. It's all part of life. And especially with COVID, you know, it's not even necessarily about loss of people. It's about loss of our world and our normal life and the way that we thought life was going to be. So it's exploring these things and trying to find a voice and to make sense in a little bit of it, and also in a sense to create something beautiful out of something terrible, you know, which has devastated your life.
Yes, how do I move forward is the question at that time, isn't it?
Okay, I'm going to now move over to Sophie. Thank you, Annabelle. That was really, I hope people will explore the link so that you can, and we look forward to see what comes out of the Throes of Grief group. It's quite hard to say. Thank you. Well, we'll come back at the end and open everything up. So we'll see you in a bit. Sophie, so you and I had a chat before as well, and I think one of the things that struck me the most was that you talked about being kind of working through your grief actively, but you just want to just give a little bit of the story about what happened.
Yeah, so in 2017, basically, my son Felix, who was 20, died suddenly and unexpectedly. It was a complete shock. So, and it was a particularly traumatic kind of thing to happen because, as I say, it was sudden and unexpected. So he was a student at university and I was going up to see him in a play. And I got there and he wasn't at our meeting place. And, you know, I didn't really think anything of it, and tried to contact him and he wasn't answering his phone. And basically, to cut a long story short, I found some of his people that he was in the play with, and they said they hadn't seen him for a couple of days and he hadn't turned up for the dress rehearsal. And so basically I tried to get hold of the people who run the halls of residence, asked them to go and check on him, and they said they would bring me back. So I waited in this university theatre where the play was supposed to be happening, and nothing happened. So I drove there, feeling more and more sort of fearful. And I got there, and there was an ambulance outside, and I just knew he'd died. And of course the police were involved because it was a sudden unexpected death. It was horrendous. It turned out that he died of SUDEP, which is sudden unexpected death and epilepsy, which was a complete shock. I mean, you know, he had epilepsy, but you know, we never thought he could take his life. And so, you know, basically our lives fell apart, and I very soon found myself writing letters to him, which is how my book has come about. So that's really the story of what happened. So it's 4 years on, and the book will hopefully be published. It probably won't be next year. It'll probably be the year after. But it's essentially, my book is essentially a response to, you know, the unthinkable, really.
And this is not by any means your first book. You are a writer and you're a broadcaster, and you know the word is your mode of expression. So I'm curious to know how this feels different. How different this feels to be, you know, writing about something that, you know, is so deep inside.
It's very, very different. I mean, I'm used to doing, my background is as a journalist and as a news reporter, and I'm used to being incredibly succinct and getting straight to the point and having to, you know, write a story for radio in like 3 sentences. And so this is incredibly difficult and very challenging. And it's about, as Annabelle says, it's like a deep dive. It's into facing up to the horror, really, and trying to describe how that feels. It's also, obviously, it's therapeutic in that it helps me to write about it, but it has to be made for an audience as well. So a lot of what the process of writing the book is about is taking some of the raw stuff that I wrote and kind of tarting it up, if you know what I mean, to sort of you know, because the reader doesn't necessarily want or need to know all of it. You know, it's about trying to create something that people can relate to and, you know, might actually help them as well.
That seems to me to have something quite in common with Annabelle's ceramics, in the sense that the act of making may itself be quite therapeutic, but actually it needs to be something else in order to succeed as a piece of artwork. That's
right. It has to have its own. It has to have its own identity and its sort of universality, if you like. But I think, actually, ironically, in a way, creating something is actually therapeutic as well, although that's not the point. But it's creating something out of something that has form and meaning, and, you know, in terms of a piece of writing, a narrative, a shape, you know. I suppose it relates all back to how, you know, as humans, we like to shape the world, we like to investigate our response to the world, and then we like to produce something at the end of it that is our response. And that's kind of, I suppose, what I'm trying to do.
And you talked to me about kind of actively working through this process of grief, and I think part of that is also about doing what you also do a lot, which is being outdoors, being in the natural world, and swimming. So talk to me a little bit about how those two things come together?
Well, I suppose it's about kind of almost getting away from the particularity of human experience to be more kind of immersed in nature. So the week after Felix died, I just swam every day in the sea. I just felt I had to immerse, and it was something about the sea, its vastness, and its endlessness, that I wanted to kind of be in that sort of non-state, if you like, or that absent state, or that feeling of kind of almost being away from sort of human mortality, if you like, and to try to be part of something bigger and shapeless and perhaps without beginning and end. And I think, you know, if you have a very close encounter with death and mortality, I kind of found myself just wanting to, I don't know, explore what that might be like, not existing anymore. And somehow the sea, particularly for me, is sort of relates to that, but also just generally being outside and being in close contact with the earth, and things like flora and fields and rivers. It comes back to that, you know, that phrase in the Bible, dust thou art and to dust thou will return, which I'm probably not expressing correctly.
I think that's
but
right.
you know, having buried my son and he's in the ground, he's part of the earth. So I'm sort of trying to again make a kind of connection through the earth, through being outside, because kind of that's what he is now. You know, he's dust.
Yeah, I'll ask you to read in a minute, but you also said that in that immediate aftermath, that friends went swimming with you, as they do anyway, because you often swim in a group. And I just wondered if that was a different language, a way of supporting your grief without having to find the words.
Totally, yeah. And they were just there. We didn't really talk. They were just there. And yeah, it was a kind of way of sharing it. Just being alongside, you know, being alongside me.
Yeah.
And also that spread back through previous years and previous connections to my life. Sure. They were there. Do you know what I mean? And Felix would have been there in the past.
Yeah. Let's go back to the book. Would you like to read as a little bit?
Yeah. So the book's called The Green Hill, and the Green Hill is sort of my word, or my brother's word actually, for the place where Felix is buried, which is a natural burial ground called Sharpham Meadow in Devon, and it's on a beautiful hillside overlooking the Dart estuary. And it's just a sort of meadow with graves, just mounds, and it's very sort of plain, but it's very beautiful. So this is the first bit from the book. I'm back at the green hill far away. The wind on the exposed hillside sides my body. It always seems to be howling a gale up here, and as usual, I'm thinking, what now? I've been standing like this for a while, staring across the fields to the great white building in the distance that dominates the skyline. Beyond it, under a heavy grey sky, lies the sea. In the other direction, away to my left, is the lumpy outline of Dartmoor. I need to be here, but I also have to get away. I head down to the estuary below and walk along the bank where wild garlic is emerging. There are no flowers yet, just broad, shiny leaves and a faint, oniony echo. Scarlet elf cups nestle in the moss. As I walk through the trees, the river glimpses, its smooth surface glinting in the sun. Some geese pass above, their coarse cries reverberating. I reach North Quay, an old stone jetty festooned with seaweed. As I begin to change, a light breeze blows downstream, making me shiver. As usual, I leave my clothes in an untidy heap on top of my rucksack, impatient to get in. I walk across the ragged grass which covers the top of the quay, a feeling of dampness in my toes, and climb down the old metal ladder of the jetty. Its rungs are cold and hard on my feet. I sink backwards off it into the brine of the River Dart. The water is turbid but silky. The tide is going out and I swim upstream past the twisting oaks, whose long boughs dip into the water like the arms of wizened old ghosts reaching for sustenance. Delicate fronds of bladderwrack float by me in the water. I look up to the green hill high above where I've just been, and in that moment, I feel myself fall away. The green hill is where my son Felix is buried. My brother James calls it the green hill far away. Tiny snowdrops appear there in January, fighting their way through the rocky ground and up through the graves. They are followed by primroses and daffodils, then poppies and grasses, legions of grasses swaying on top of the mounds, blown by the wind that travels in over the moor from the Atlantic. These flowers, these grasses, this smooth river that flows below the green hill to the sea, they are all beautiful distractions from the fact that his body is buried here. It is down in the impoverished stony earth below, wrapped in an old linen sheet that I inherited from my mother. There are 13 cowrie shells in with him too, that we gathered on Cornish beaches on countless holidays, one for every member of the family to keep him company. I continue to swim upriver, pushing against the outgoing tide, trying to remember Felix's childhood. Momentarily, I'm back in our tiny garden in Cambridge years before all this happened. The apple blossom is out, pink and white blobs dotting the ground like confetti, as Felix runs around the scrap of lawn, giggling. He's wearing his t-shirt with a dinosaur on. I'm lying under the tree listening as he screams with delight and huffs and puffs. The sun is warm on my face and I look up through the branches to the blue, cloudless sky above. We're having a heat wave. A large cardboard box lies on the grass, its flaps open and inviting. He goes up to the box, gets down on his hands and knees and pulls open one of the flaps, revealing its dark interior. He looks inside and then back at me questioningly. Go on, in you go, I say. He pulls open the other flap and I watch him disappear inside, making a great show of carefully closing the flaps behind him. Seconds later, one of the flaps is punched open and his fist, followed by his face, appears. Ha ha ha, he squeals, thrilled with his performance. After this, a few more fleeting moments come back to me, but it feels as though my memories are suffocating in a thick sea of mud. It's hard work swimming against the current. Being here in this river is both a penance and an act of worship. I need to be here. It is a kind of compulsion, but also a distraction, an empty space where nothing has meaning or relevance, a place I can be absent. In the water, I shrink back to a sort of visceral essence of being, rewinding back to Felix when he was part of my body, part of me, grown from me. Moving along the shoreline, I notice sea green lichen all over the banks like mold on a cheese. It sits next to velvety moss which grows on the exposed tree roots. The water ripples past me, gentle and soothing, making a pleasant sound. I put my face in, holding my breath. Nothing is visible underwater. All I can see through my goggles is briny murk, but the river is soft, dappling against my cheeks. Further up the estuary, there is a marshy area where I get out, my feet oozing through the silky silt as I walk towards firmer ground. Some ducks are visible in the distance, and a huge weathered tree trunk lies beached on the shore. I sit on the trunk to rest, choosing a worn section denuded of bark, a natural seat. Again, my eyes are drawn up to the green hill which overlooks the estuary. I can see the trees on the skyline and the oval cob building which sits at the top. Not long ago, we were gathered there, putting Felix's body in the ground. And a few weeks before that, he was a young man just 20 years old. We were a normal family then.
Thank you, Sophie. that's the prologue for the book.
Yeah.
I'm interested for you to talk some more. That embraces all of those kind of aspects that you've already talked about in a rather wonderful way, and it feels like the journey is a very natural one. That we're moving around in time, we're moving around in space. We're in the water, or in the hillside. You're in the back garden, and I wonder about this writing process, which is clearly going to be very different from, either your journalistic work or the swimming books. And how are you going to structure this book? How are you going to find the narrative?
Well, that's a very good question, because it's something I sort of have experimented with a lot, really. Thinking, should it be a diary? Should it be, very, chronological? And what I've come up with is a sort of, it's got a kind of 3 layers. So the first layer is a letter. So there wasn't actually a letter there. But after that, each chapter starts actually with a letter to Felix. And those letters are sort of in a chronological order from when he died to, coming up to the present. So there's that layer. And then the second layer is the present. So it's how I'm reacting and how I'm, what's going on post his death. And then the third layer is about telling the story of Felix's life. So, and they've got different structures. So the letters is obviously, in the second person to you. The present is in the present tense, and then Felix's life is in the past tense, because I think it could be a bit complicated. So hopefully that will work for the reader, because I kind of feel like, for it to kind of gain relevance and meaning for the reader, they need to get to know Felix as well, what he was like. But that actually is the most difficult thing to write about, because it's, it's so hard to remember things from the past if you don't write them down. And it's always the devil is in the detail, and you're trying to tell a story about somebody through perhaps incidents from their past. And that's been very challenging to try and do that. I mean, looking at photo albums helps, because you can try and trigger memories that way. So that's what I've come up with in terms of how to try and tell the story in an interesting way, and to get over the different aspects of the experience, because it's very multi-layered. It's about trying to maintain that relationship with my son, who's died. It's about, how I cope with grief, and telling a story, which really is what a book should ultimately be about.
So what's the difference then between doing this as a personal exercise, doing this as simply as a catharsis, as a way to work through a grief process, and writing a book that's for publication?
Well, it's about tailoring and polishing material and ordering material, which is kind of what I've just described in terms of coming up with a structure, because all I have is letters. I've got these notebooks full of the letters. So a lot of the work's been about trying to turn those letters into the book. Because yes, they're letters, but in a way that's like a diary as well. So it's turning that into the book and making it into something that's got a structure and has got a beginning and a middle and an end. And although I think my editor said to me, which was a nice thing to say, is don't feel you've got to have a resolution. Because obviously
there isn't one. There isn't one.
No, there isn't really. It's going to go on forever. So with very much with any kind of storytelling, filmmaking, anything, you've got the classic story arc, which resolves at the end, and this isn't going to resolve at the end in the same way. Although I want to use particular scenes to try and give the reader a sense of that, but of course it's never over, so working out how it ends is going to be quite tricky.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because the book will have to end, and it needs to have a proper end. But what that end's going to be, I'm still working out.
Yeah. And what's that relationship with an editor like? Is this an editor you know, or is this somebody who's you don't know?
He's the contact at the publisher who is basically the person that I liaise with.
Right.
But I haven't. The manuscript is about 2/3 of the way through, and they don't do a schedule until it's done. And then when the manuscript is done, then I will be assigned an editor, who I don't think will be my editor that I'm talking about.
So you chose to publish through Unbound. Can you? I'm not sure everybody will know about that. Do you want to just tell us a bit more about it?
Yeah. So they're what they call themselves the world's only crowdfunding publisher. So the idea is that it actually goes back to people like Johnson and 17th and 18th, 19th century. People would subscribe to a book, and that would be how it would get paid for. And in the books, you would have a list of the subscribers, and that's essentially what it is for the 21st century. And so it's an alternative way of publishing. So it's a very simple idea. People pledge to buy the book in advance. They pay in advance, and then that funds the publishing of the book. But it is it's not like self-publishing, so you have to do a submission to the publishers just like any other publisher, and they only choose the ones that they think are good enough. And then you have to start the process. Once they accept that, then they set up a page on their website, and you have these various rewards that you can offer. So signed hardback, paperback, all these kind of different things. I did some quite quirky things, like I like knitting, so I offered knitted socks, hand knitted by myself. And then that process of crowdfunding starts, which is incredibly draining and difficult, and you shouldn't ever bother to do it unless you're prepared to really just flog yourself and put yourself out there. If you're shy of retiring, it's not for you.
Don't try. Yes. Is it an open process? So unlike some crowdfunding has a deadline. If you don't meet the target by the deadline, you don't get anything. Or does this just go until you meet your target?
Yeah, they don't put any limits on it.
In a way, which is more draining, because it means you've just got to keep hammering
keep
away
going, keep on going until you're funded. Yeah. So it's but it's great. It's been brilliant for me, because I had lots of writers. It's so hard to get published. And agents maybe take 1 or 2% of the people that submit every year. I had a very close call with an agent, and they asked to see more of the manuscript, and then eventually they came back and they said, we love it, but we've got too many competing similar things, and we can't take it on. And at that point, I suddenly remembered about Unbound, and I thought, maybe I'll try them.
Yeah.
And so literally just sent it off to them. You have to provide. It's quite a lot of work, so you've got to provide 3 chapters, and you've got to sum the book up in 1 sentence, which is incredibly hard. Anyway.
Tell me about your other books, and we've talked a little bit about the complete difference. So I'm just curious for people to know a bit more about the other books that you've written.
So they're basically wild swimming guidebooks. So I've written 3, and the latest one's Wild Swimming Walks Cornwall, which came out in March, and it kind of does what it says on the tin. So it's 28 walks. They're normally circular walks with swims in Cornwall, and they're very much, it's much more, it's kind of a bit like hack work, I call it, really, because I can kind of it's basically writing about a place, doing all the research, finding out lots of interesting things. Very, very sort of, it's got lots of information in it, which is actually quite hard and quite tedious to compile. So we have to write the directions, we have to put in all the information like distances and places to eat and stuff like that. And the most fun part, I think, is taking the pictures and writing the text, so that each chapter will have a text that tells you all about all the lovely things on the wall that you'll see. So really, it's more kind of journalism, I suppose, than writing in an artistic sense.
Yeah.
But they're great fun to do, and it's kind of what I like doing anyway. So I'm just doing what I enjoy doing, putting those. And I'm now working on one which will come out next year, which is about Dorset and East Devon. So yeah, I was out on the East Devon coast yesterday, doing an amazing walk between like two Devon combes from Salcombe Regis down to Western Mouth and Salcombe Mouth, which was amazing walk. So yeah, that's the sort of other thing I do.
I wonder when you're swimming, I don't know where your mind goes, or whether your mind actually just has a period of quiet, but I wonder how much of the writing for the Green Hill you process when you're swimming, or perhaps it's unconscious, perhaps it's happening, perhaps the swimming allows you a freedom to not think.
I think when I'm swimming, I'm kind of not really thinking, and it's not really till I come back and I write about it that I kind of relate it to how I'm feeling, or you know, what effect that experience has had on me, and had on my experience of grief, or whatever it is. I think it's very sensual. It's very much being in a particular moment, and I sort of live it at the time and don't think about it too much, and then later it might crystallize into something that has a bit more meaning or relevance that I can share in my writing.
Yeah. We got a question from Lizzie. Lizzie, do you want to come in and just ask Sophie your question?
Hello, Sophie.
Hello.
You said that you had to sum up your book, or the for crowdfunding. You had to sum it up, and I said in my question, how did you sum it up, Sophie? I'm curious.
How do you get over the death of a child?
Okay.
Thank you.
I just had to plump for something.
It seems remarkably reductive, and yet, you know, how many artists can encapsulate something in a sentence? It's very, very hard to do.
It is, and I suppose it's not replacing the work, but it's giving people a route in, isn't it? And that's, you know, essentially when you have the blurb on the back of a book, that's what that's what you have to do. And that's what I had to do in pitching the book, really, is it forces you to think, well, what is this really about? And that's actually quite a good thing. And you can then go on to expand that. But if you start with that one thing, it's a bit like when I used to work in radio news, you know, if you get the first sentence right, everything else follows. And so if you get that summary right, everything follows from that. So yes, how do you get over the death of a child? Well, it's by swimming, it's by, you know, it's by being in nature, it's by addressing it head on, it's by, you know, it's it kind of leads you down that path. So yeah.
I would like to invite anyone, particularly maybe from Annabelle's group or anybody out there who'd like to ask a question. We've got lots of comments coming in on the chat, but I think in a way these things, this is again, it's something that's hard to find the language for, that, you know, we don't know what questions to ask because it feels difficult and sensitive. You know, it's a bit like the C word when somebody tells you they've been diagnosed with cancer and you can't respond. You just don't have the language.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've got some hands up.
Couple of
So
people there,
Gemma,
yeah.
would
Gemma
you
was
like
first, I think.
to come in?
Hi. Hi, Sophie. I'm part of Annabelle's Throes of Grief group. I lost my dad many years ago, 20 plus years ago, but very, very suddenly, and it's stayed with me, and I realised it was part of my practice. Oddly, once a year, I take the day off work the day that my dad died, and I swim out to sea, and I spent hours floating around and swimming up and down. And as my day job, I'm the book buyer for the Tates and Ives, and I happen to have next to me, by sheer coincidence, a sample of your book in my must order pile, which is just such an amazing coincidence. One of those
bizarre
twists of fate. Yeah, I've been and swam in many of your spots.
And St. Ives features heavily in there.
Yeah, it does. We might have to get you to come and talk down here one day if you can.
We'd love it. We'd love it. Yeah.
Yeah, your book, your new book sounds absolutely heartbreaking and wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And how do you reflect that 20-year-old event of your terrible death of your father? And does that, you said that still, you know, plays a role in your work, and how does it?
So my work has become more about light and kind of meditative practices. So I make things that are quite repetitive in their process, and then they're very much just about light. So I work in glass a lot, and I like the kind of coloured shadows that it creates, playing with light and shadow, and generally just trying very hard to make things that are beautiful to me, that make me feel a kind of positive, a sort of optimism in the void. And to me, it's very similar to water and being out. I went for a really long swim with friends after work yesterday, and when you swim out to sea and you're quite far out, there's something about being in that water, that kind of blending in with the sky, like you said, that space between, and there's something about that in coloured light as well. Sort of
kind of liminal, isn't it?
Yeah. So that's what I look for.
Annabelle.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sophie. I was particularly struck. There were threads that kept coming up hearing you speak, and one of them reminded me of a conversation that I'd had about the force of nature with somebody, and I remember having a conversation where we spoke about how when you receive that first news, nothing can be as bad as hearing that news, and that all-consuming new definition it has on your life. There's something about the allegory of nature being in something which is so forceful, like the sea, and committing to it, being part of it, and almost battling through it, working with the tides, not letting it sort of drag you under. There's something which becomes like a physical manifestation of the grief that you're feeling, which you feel in the force of nature. And being in water is one of those. Nothing is bigger than the feelings that you're feeling, and so you sort of feel at its mercy, but you're also bigger than it is, because you think, I can get through anything. And that really struck me, and the memories of these kind of snapshots back to previous events, being in the garden with Felix. I remember during that time of the very early stages of grief, it's like your thought processes are peppered with memories that you've completely forgotten about, but they won't necessarily be memories which are really profound. They're things like the smell of the grass as you laid on it and heard somebody laugh. And all of this matter kind of comes back up, and all nature related. And I thought that was a beautiful sort of allegory, this comparison for the feelings that you're going through, something which is metaphysical and physical.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think it is true, and it's about trying to define what it is to be alive and not dead. but also sort of to go beyond that in a way, because if you've had that brush with death, yeah, what you said about the sea and its power, actually, I haven't really thought of it like that, but it's very true. It's kind of almost like, you know, let's just embrace the void, as Gemma mentioned, because there is a void. It's a very powerful void. Yeah, I agree. Don't know if anyone has got any more questions at all or comments.
I think we will start to draw this to a close because we're out of time anyway. If the two of you would like to share your email in the chat, you can do that. If you prefer not, I can also relay questions or comments that people might have for you. We will be publishing this on the website quite soon, probably Monday. I just wanted to say that this is a First Friday, but it's also very much linked to our borrowed time theme. I've put the link in the chat earlier, and borrowed time is really very much exploring loss and grief, not just about individuals, but about our global sense of grief for what's happening to the planet around us and to the many species who are disappearing from our lives. And what we're trying to do is to bring those two experiences and those two thematics together to kind of explore the commonalities of that. So please do go and explore the website. And I just want to say thank you, huge thank you to Sophie and to Annabelle for being with us today. It's been a really fantastic session, very moving, actually, in many ways. I think there's a poetry in what you're both doing visually and with words. So good luck with it. Good luck with the continuing projects. I'd love to hear. Obviously, we will hear about the book when it's ready and it's come out. And Annabelle would love to hear more about the research group and what emerges from that. So thank you, everybody, very much. If we can just give a little clap and a wave to say thank you to Sophie and Annabelle, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.
Thank
Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.